Viewers, as the situation remains tense in the Middle East, Israel's latest offensive against Lebanon has completely flipped the script in West Asia. Donald Trump, who so far was closely coordinating with the Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has now given him a strong reprimand over the latest onslaught on Lebanon. On a social media profile on Truth Social, Donald Trump has said that he had a productive phone conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu. In the post, he said that there will be no troops going to Beirut, and any troops that are on their way have already been turned back. He further said that he had a very good call with Hezbollah, and they agreed that all shooting will stop. But behind this particular post, here's the real story. Donald Trump reportedly lashed out at the Israel Prime Minister. And it was an expletive-laden conversation, we are told. Here are some of the excerpts of what Donald Trump had told Benjamin Netanyahu that's been widely reported. You're crazy, of course, is one of the statements that has been made. You'd be in prison if it weren't for me, is also what Donald Trump has said. I'm saving you, I'm saving your ABC. You can hear what's written over there, you can read what's written there. Everybody hates you now is a very, very direct word that is coming from Trump to Netanyahu, is what we are told as well. So this is, of course, some of the statements. In fact, he's also gone on to ask what he's doing exactly. Some of the statements of Donald Trump is quoted by the US media. Now, as per United States media, they say this is one of the worst phone calls between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu since he returned to office. Further, the US media says that Trump and Netanyahu have had several tense calls between the two of them. But both sides have closely coordinated on the Iran war in the past. This time, however, Trump was reportedly angered by Netanyahu's escalation in Lebanon, and Trump now fears that these attacks could complicate an already tense situation in the Middle East. Remember that this comes at a time when the US and Iran are yet to formally announce a deal that would end the violence once and for all. A tense ceasefire may be in place, but even at that moment, both sides are struggling to find middle ground to ensure lasting peace in the region. Now, there's been a back and forth between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu over the Lebanon conundrum. And this has been an issue where the two sides have failed to agree on multiple occasions. On the 28th of February, America and Israel began the airstrikes on Iran. On the 16th of April, Trump says Israel and Lebanon have agreed on a ceasefire. On 19th of May, Netanyahu told Trump that delaying attacks is a mistake. On the 1st of June, Trump reprimanded Netanyahu over the attacks that took place on Lebanon, and now we've seen how this has all played out. Remember that Lebanon has been a sticking point ever since the war began. While US and Iran have had differences over Lebanon, it appears even the US and Israel have not been on the same page over it. In the past, there were disagreements over the initial ceasefire as well, owing to the position on Lebanon. What are these differences? Washington's fine print specifically is that Lebanon was not included in any deal. Israel's open front was that ceasefire doesn't apply to Lebanon, and Tehran has specifically said that the attack on Hezbollah equals an attack on Iran. We've also seen what's been stated by Washington in the past, that this is a separate skirmish. Israel said the war is against Hezbollah, which will continue, and Tehran saying that they will deliver a regret-inducing response as well. Some of the very important statements that have been coming in. Now, they've all, of course, had very differing points of view on what Lebanon is, but remember that US has also played an important role in getting them all to the negotiating table and talking at the same time.
A reported explosive phone call between US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has exposed what may be the deepest public rift yet between the two leaders. According to Axios, Trump angrily confronted Netanyahu over Israel's planned escalation in Lebanon, warning that strikes on Beirut could derail ongoing US diplomacy with Iran. The confrontation came as Israel threatened attacks on Hezbollah targets in Beirut's southern suburbs following fresh rocket fire from the Iran-backed group. crisis was triggered after Hezbollah launched attacks on Israeli military positions, prompting Netanyahu to order preparations for strikes in Beirut's Dahiyeh district. But Trump reportedly viewed the move as a dangerous escalation that risked undermining a broader regional framework involving Iran, Lebanon, and Hezbollah. Axios reported that Trump accused Netanyahu of acting disproportionately and harming Israel's international standing. The exchange highlights a growing divergence between Washington's diplomatic priorities and Israel's military objectives. While Trump has been pushing to preserve negotiations with Tehran and prevent a wider regional conflict, Netanyahu has signaled that Israel will continue military operations against Hezbollah, regardless of outside pressure. Despite Trump later describing the call as productive and claiming Israeli forces had been turned back, Netanyahu publicly insisted that Israel's position remained unchanged. The real story, therefore, is not Hezbollah's latest attack. It is Trump's increasingly public effort to restrain Netanyahu, a move that reveals growing
And joining us for more on what we can expect between US and Iran and the latest developments considering Trump and Netanyahu's recent exchange is Trita Parsi, is of course Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, but of course is known for his views as an expert on Iran as well as other international affairs matters. Thank you so much, Trita Parsi, for joining us. And we're speaking at a time, when we've seen reports in the American press about very, very stern words, tough language, to put it very mildly, that has been used by President Trump against Prime Minister Netanyahu over a phone call. Now, this is about Israeli threats against Hezbollah in Lebanon at a time when Iran has been insistent that any broader ceasefire should also include a stoppage to hostilities in Lebanon. What do you make of what's emerged and what it tells us about how the entire war has panned out?
The Iranians have made it a red line for them that if there is to be a ceasefire, it has to be region-wide, meaning there cannot be an end to the war between the US and Iran, but then Israel continues to bombard southern Lebanon, ethnically cleanse that country, and annex much of its territory, which is exactly what it is doing at this point. So this then, I think from the outset, the American side may not have fully understood how central this was to the Iranians. I think it's much clearer at this point. But it's also important because Netanyahu is using an unnecessary escalation in Lebanon as a way of sabotaging the US-Iran diplomacy. And it really forces Trump to make a choice. Does he want to get a deal that ends the war and pursues US interests, or is he going to defer to what the Israelis want? Because the Israeli desire, of course, is for this war to continue, not just with Hezbollah, but with Iran as well. Trump wants to get out of it, but if he wants to get out of it, he's going to have to come to terms and have the come to Jesus moment with the Israelis and really break with them in terms of this policy, at least. And what we saw yesterday with this phone call may have been the beginning of it. It may also just end up being an isolated episode. But it is not surprising per se to see that tensions between the US and Israel flare up the more the US is interested in diplomacy and the less it is interested in war.
Right. But does this also in that sense mean that Iran is perhaps having its way? Because, unlike the earlier situation that we saw vis-a-vis the ceasefire, their condition that the conflict include the larger rubric of the entire Middle East peace deal and Lebanon also be part of that is something that Americans and Israelis are now having to respond to. Is this then a case of Iran perhaps calling the shots about how the negotiations can then proceed?
By and large, I do think that the Iranians have had a significant influence on the parameters of this negotiation. because of the simple fact that Iran did not lose the war. The U.S. strategically faced a major setback with this war. The U.S. should never have started this war in the first place. But the war has led to a scenario in which the Iranians are now in control of the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians can choke the entire global economy. Trump is faced with increased difficulties at home as a result of this unnecessary war that was never supported by even a small minority of Americans. It was a very tiny minority of Americans that supported this war. So Trump really did a number on himself by listening to the Israelis and going with their advice, which was a complete contradiction to his own promises, to his own base, that he would be the president that would end these endless wars rather than starting new ones.
Now, and also this is an important question, because if Trump is lashing out with this intensity that's been reported in the American media, does it also show signs that there is desperation on part of Trump to sue for peace? And if this is desperation, is it because domestically he's facing problems, including rising gas prices, the approval ratings, or even the challenge of a midterm poll looming?
I think Trump is in dire need of an agreement, but so are the Iranians. Both sides do need an agreement. Trump needs it because, as you mentioned, his political fortunes are going down the drain as a result of this war. His entire presidency may end up becoming a failure and defined by this strategic mistake, just as much as George W. Bush's presidency ended up becoming defined by the strategic mistake of invading Iraq. The Iranians need a deal as well, because ultimately, their economy is in very bad shape. They were already in a very bad shape before this war. Now they're suffering from more than $300 billion in damages. So they are in need of sanctions relief, and they can only get sanctions relief through a deal with the United States. They cannot get it on the battlefield.
And, you know, this is not the first time that Trump is lashing out at Israel. We've seen, of course, what happened following the announcement of a ceasefire when Israel continued attacks. For instance, the attack that took place on Qatar, and President Trump having, formally having gotten the Emir of Qatar and Netanyahu on the line. And you've written about this as well. So this isn't the first time that US's or President Trump's displeasure with Israel and its actions is coming out in the public domain.
Not at all. There's been a very tense relationship between the two of them. It seems like the glue between them is not necessarily a common perspective, but rather the fact that so many of Trump's top donors, particularly Miriam Adelson, are very, very partial to the Israelis and have been pushing for Netanyahu's agenda for quite some time, rather than that there actually is a commonality between Netanyahu and Trump on a deeper level. And it is noteworthy to see that we have seen a pattern in the past in which American presidents apparently privately express a lot of anger at Netanyahu, but then publicly adopt a united front. That was clearly seen under Biden's administration, and people started to really get tired of stories about how angry he was at Netanyahu, whereas in reality he was giving full support to the genocide that Israel was committing in Gaza.
All right.
With Trump, we've seen something different because the public, not private tensions, have been there and quite visible. You mentioned the case of forcing Netanyahu to apologize to the Emir of Qatar. And what also happened in that instance is that Netanyahu came out and denied that there had been an apology. So then the White House released the image, the footage of him actually reading that apology to the Emir from the Oval Office. So the White House has been willing to do things publicly to push back against against Netanyahu in a manner that previous administrations have been far more careful about.
Right. Now, we've also seen, and what Israel's version is that why they're carrying out these operations in South Lebanon is that they feel that they are to pull back now. It would allow the Hezbollah to regroup, and then it would be back to square one despite all the damage that perhaps they've managed to inflict. Is this why perhaps Netanyahu too is frustrated that he's being told by Trump to stop?
I don't think that is the real reason for the Israelis. The Israeli objective here is to use these tactical excuses to get to their strategic objective, which is to annex more territory from the Palestinians and from the Lebanese and from the Syrians. At first, they will say that this is just a buffer zone to protect them from these different groups. But over time, the buffer zones end up getting annexed, and then the Israelis need new buffer zones to protect the old buffer zones. This is what is happening in Syria, for instance, in which the Israelis had conquered the Golan Heights illegally, taken it. Then through the Abraham Accord, the United States recognizes their annexation of the Golan Heights. And now the Israelis have taken a much larger swath of Syrian territory as the new buffer zone to protect the Golan. This is part of the greater Israel project that the Israelis are pursuing, that they're actually totally transparent and open about. It's just that in most media, at least in the Western media, it's hardly ever spoken about. But it is about expanding the territory of Israel and making Israel a dominant military power in the Middle East. Within that process, they will point to tactical things that they cannot pull back because then Hezbollah would regroup. But if you recall what the Israelis were saying just a year ago, they said that Hezbollah had been completely defeated. Now, apparently, they cannot pull back because then Hezbollah would regroup.
Right. Dr. Parsi, also want to get you in on the issue of the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran didn't really control the strait before the 28th of February, but it does so now. Now, is this a chokehold that's prompting Trump to behave the way he is? Because even as he may claim that America doesn't really need to rely on the strait for its own energy security, the impact that it's having globally is very well known.
Absolutely. The Strait of Hormuz control means that the Iranians have an ability to choke the entire global economy. And even though the American side is not suffering from that directly because the U.S. is not importing oil from the Middle East, reality is that it is creating higher oil prices globally, which is affecting American buyers. Of course, Asian countries are suffering the most because of not only higher oil prices, but also because of the fact that there's now fuel shortages that they're suffering from because they don't have the same reserves that the U.S. had, et cetera. And it's very unfair because these Asian countries had nothing to do with this war, but they're the ones who are suffering the most from this war that was started by choice of the United States and Israel. But because of this control, the Iranians have a tremendous amount of leverage. The Trump administration tried to neutralize that leverage by imposing a blockade on the blockade. But I think, frankly, even though it imposed even more cost on the Iranians, it backfired because it imposed even a greater cost on Trump himself.
Right. Apart from, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, the blockage itself, the other big sticking point is of the nuclear program and Iran's enriched uranium, which as per estimates is up to 60%, which is, of course, one of the major bones of contention. Now, we've seen reports coming in that Mojtaba Khomeini had said that this enriched uranium should stay in Iran. The Russians have offered to keep it in their country. Do you think the IRGC would agree to shift the enriched uranium to a third country? Because this is something that the US also does not appear to be willing to relent on.
So the Iranians have shown some flexibility in the previous weeks on this issue, but it seems to have been walked back at this point. So it's not entirely clear. What I think is a clear red line for them when it comes to the stockpile is that they will not ship it to the United States. They can ship it to a third country, perhaps even ship 100% of it to a third country, but not to the United States. And I think Trump has now also backed off from that and has said it doesn't matter if the stockpile is diluted in Iran or outside of Iran, lay down some markers that were more flexible than his original position on this issue.
And purely in terms of military objectives, Trump and Israel have managed to kill Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, several top Iranian officials, but the Iranian regime has fought back. And maybe the last 60-odd days say that they've also given them a chance to regroup and restock. What would it take for things to really move up the escalation ladder once again, in your view?
I think if we have a breakdown of the talks, if there is a flare-up in Lebanon, then we risk a situation in which the war restarts. The problem for Trump, of course, is that he ultimately does not have any good military options. If he did, he would have used them by now instead of negotiating. But there's nothing he can do that doesn't allow the Iranians to retaliate in return in a manner that would further and much more dramatically impact the global economy, and by that, help ruin his entire presidency. That's part of the reason why Trump is suing for some sort of a peace and negotiation, because despite the fact that the U.S. is a military superpower, it actually does not have any good military options vis-a-vis Iran at this point.
Right. How do you also see this permanently affecting the relations between the United States and its Gulf allies? Because those allies are the ones who've borne the maximum in terms of brunt of Iran's attacks.
Many of them have, not all of them, though. But you're absolutely right. This is going to be an inflection point for the U.S.'s role and presence in the Middle East. I think after this, many of these countries are going to diversify their security baskets and no longer put all of their eggs in the American basket and try to find new security partners. They will not abandon the U.S. They will probably even buy more weapons from the U.S. But I'm not so sure that they're going to fight hard to keep any of the American bases or even pay for their rebuilding, because those bases turn out to be strategic detriments rather than a strategic asset. Every time the United States has gone to war with Iran, the U.S. has emptied its bases in the region. If it cannot use those bases for war, then what's the point of the bases?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Finally, Dr. Parsi, before I let you go, how do you see it all panning out in terms of an off-ramp for everyone here involved? I know you're not a soothsayer, but what do you realistically expect to happen?
I think that there still is a chance for there to be a memorandum of understanding and very tense negotiations that can lead to war. I know that it looks very dark right now, given particularly the developments of the last 24 to 48 hours. But part of the reason why I'm still somewhat optimistic that there can be a deal is because the absence of a deal is devastating for both sides, not just for one side. The Iranians need a deal. They need the sanctions relief. The United States needs a deal because it needs to extract itself from this kind of situation. A continuation of this would be devastating for both of them and even more devastating for some of the Asian economies. So the incentive structure at the end of the day is to go towards a deal, despite the fact that it is very, very difficult.
All right. Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down for our viewers. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.